Today's October 10th, 2011. My name is Joe Bruckner. I'm a volunteer with the Atlanta History Center. And with me today is Ed Woods, who is also a volunteer with the History Center. And we're honored to have Clint and Donna Day with us. Clint is a Vietnam veteran, served two tours in Vietnam, and he's agreed to come and tell us his story, the story of his life, and particularly his military service in connection with the Library of Congress Veterans History Project. Clint and Donna, we really appreciate you coming in today, and we're very honored to have you here. Would you please give us your full name and current address?
Well, my name is Clinton Edward Day. I live in Cumming, Georgia, up on Lake Lanier, and I'm fortunate enough to go down to Sarasota, Florida in the winters.
Good. Where and when were you born?
I was born in San Francisco, California in September 1942, and being an old blue from the University of California, I'm ashamed to say in Stanford Hospital.
Looking at your information here, I believe you got a birthday coming up in a couple of days, don't you?
I do.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about your upbringing.
Well, I was, my dad was an insurance broker. I was pretty much middle class kid in San Francisco. And the only thing noteworthy was I went to a private high school that's endowed by the two founding fathers of San Francisco, James Lick and the Wilmerding School of Arts, called Lick Wilmerding High School. People from the city know it. And that kind of channeled me into the University of California, which handled half of that endowment. So in 1960, I headed off to the University of California. I tell people I went away to college 17 miles and 13 of them were on a bridge to get over to Berkeley. But in those days, because Cal was a land grant college, you know, we all had to take ROTC. And so I was in men's ROTC for 2 years, and then the upper 2 years were voluntary, but we all did it, all fraternity guys and everybody, because you got $50 a month. You were selling your soul to the devil for $50, but it was kind of a camaraderie group, and we all were close. And I remember people like Craig Morton, who played football for Cal, was in our regiment there, and some really lifelong friendships. But by the accident of history, we all graduated 64, 65, and you know, went right off to basic branch school. I was Signal Corps, and the funny thing about that is, near your, in the beginning of your senior year in ROTC, they give you a choice of the branches of service that you want. One of them had to be a combat arm. So I had things like Finance Corps, Adjutant General's Corps, and my combat arm was a Signal Corps. Well, you know what I got? I got the Signal Corps. But the first time I'd ever been in Georgia was to come down to Fort Gordon to attend Signal Officers Basic, which was October of 1965. And I think it was a 9-week course. And we sat alphabetically for that period of time. And my last name being Day, I sat next to a guy named Max Cleland on my left, Cleland Day. And we all became pretty close. But Max was from a suburb of Atlanta, Lithonia. So I went up to his home a couple times on the weekends and got to know him. And of course, the reason I mention his name is everybody knows he was a U.S. Senator from Georgia, and I'll touch on that later. But I also befriended a guy named Olin. We were from all over the country. You know, I remember the thickest accent of anyone in that class was a kid from Maine. He was from like up there on the Canadian border, and you couldn't cut his accent with a knife. And but anyway, a real good friend named Olin Linky was in that class. And Olin and I were the two business majors. So we both left there and went up to Fort Lee, Virginia, to Army Supply course. And Olin was married and his wife was pregnant at the time. So we had these wonderful orders. He was headed to some exotic place, and I was going to the Topahanna Army Depot in the Scranton, Pennsylvania, Pocono Mountains. I already bought my head skis, and the Friday before we were to graduate from Fort Lee, we had this class leader who he kind of took great pleasure in giving everyone these little green phone call slips. We called them the green weenies. And one Friday was Olin's in my turn, and we got green weenies, and then our orders were changed to the 972nd Signal Battalion, which had left Topahanna Army Depot, but was now in Quy Nhon, South Vietnam. So I got 10 days from when I graduated to get over there, because I was a bachelor, and Olin got 30. And the funny thing about that is, when I got in country, of course I went through the old repo depot in Tan Son Nhut. We all went through there, I think. And I worked my way up to Quy Nhon on a couple of flights. And this is February of 1966, still pretty primitive. You know, the Army depot up there was all tents and nothing permanent buildings. And so I found out where the colonel was that commanded the battalion, and they had a little tent set up. The good old Army already had an officers club established. And I went over and I introduced myself, and somebody had told me that one of the lieutenants that was going home first, that had derosed or was separating, was down in the commanding the detachment in Saigon, and that might be an opportunity. So I seized upon that and went over there and convinced this colonel that I was his man.
When was this?
This would have been February of 1966, or late January, February, the first week of February. Okay. And by sheer good fortune, I was back on a Mac flight to Saigon. Huh. And what it was is they took 3 of these Signal Battalion detachments that were specialized in crypto, the machines, the maintenance, and the code delivery, and put them all together, attached them to Mac V in Saigon. And we were all housed in an old villa in Cholan, which is a Chinese suburb of Saigon. And the villa had a kind of a basement that must have been a vault for someone else, but it was a natural, secure location in a compound with SOG. Remember Special Operations Group? They were in our compound. And so these 3 detachments were brought together, and we were only 11 guys. There were 2 lieutenants and 9 enlisted men, and then there was an old career major, Reese, that I can remember, who had actually been a warrant officer, longtime employee of NSA out in Washington. He was our commander. And we were doing one heck of a volume because we were supplying all the branches of the service.
Explain what you were doing specifically.
Well, we actually supplied the crypto machines. That even the Navy had their own logistical chain, but for the Air Force, the Army, and anybody in country, we provided the machines, and more importantly, the codes. And we had like 4 or 5 levels of codes. I don't think it's classified at all to say that one of the codes we handled was for the atomic cannon. You know, the old saying was, wherever the troops went, we had a little backup in case we were going to get overrun. And that particular code was always what put me out in the field, because whenever it got compromised and you had to resupply the field, you had to either have a warrant officer or a commissioned officer deliver the code. And so being a junior second lieutenant in the Signal Corps, I spent a lot of time out there at Tan Son Nhut flying those codes. And I started off, you know, as a real warrior. I'd wear one of those small carbines across my chest and pack of 45, you know, issued weapons. But quickly, within 3 or 4 months, I had my dad ship me over a disassembled 38. And that was my weapon in my briefcase. I stripped down and traveled light. And but anyway, those codes, in 1966, we didn't have it compartmentalized. And one of the things I'd like to delve on later is, I went back by accident in 1971 for a partial second tour, and I was able to see how that little Field Army Issue Office had been improved, expanded. And long story short, most of my memories in Vietnam are from that full first 12 months, in 1966-67, when I was making these flights. I had orders that would bump anyone off the aircraft and put me on it because it was top secret emergency. And so I'd go out to Tan Son Nhut, and they'd bring planes back from the tarmac, drop the, you know, C-130, C-123, drop the gate, and I would run on. And I guess probably the worst, because I've told these stories so often, the worst flight I ever had was I was coming back from, I think it was the first air cab at Pleiku. on the airstrip up there, and in 1966, the VC controlled some of the landing area. And so they would only take C-130s in there, and then they'd go straight up to get out of there, because that C-130 could go straight up. And one time I ran on, they put the gate down, and everyone knows, you know, there's no windows, and you sit like you're a paratrooper facing the side of the airplane. And we took off, and I'm just freezing. You know, we went straight up, and then we leveled off, and I've got like these short sleeve fatigues on or something. And I look up, and they're just condensing the air coming out. It's so cold. And then I looked down, and it was such a strange crew. There was no cargo, and a couple of Air Force guys back there, and that was it. And then I looked down on the floor of the aircraft, and it was a Graves registration flight. And we had over 100 body bags in that C-130.
Gosh.
So I think that's probably the most graphic memory I have of the whole war.
What was your emotion at the time when you
Oh
saw
my
that?
goodness. I mean, I was just, I'd been in country several months, so I was steeled to just accepting the you know, the atmosphere of being in Vietnam, but man, that would have hit anyone home.
Yeah.
You know, all of them were newly killed, and apparently probably some big battle up there in the Two Corps Highlands area. And just the holiness and the reverence you'd have for all those body bags. I remember going up to the C-130 had like a little 3-foot stairway up to the, you know, the crew flew. And I remember going up there and poking my head around. I said, "You guys mind?" And they said, "No, no, come on." And I sat in the jump seat in the back and flew up there the rest of the flight. But that was probably my most emotional flight, and my absolute most fun, best war story ever was I was out at Tonson at one time on another one of these emergency. I think I almost remember what happened in this case. We had had some sort of skirmish on the Cambodian border, and a couple of officers who had codes in their pockets had been killed, and we didn't know if we'd had our codes compromised or not. But it was like 2 levels of supply in the field were wiped out because they had to, you know, replace. So we had to urgently get some more out to the field. So I was out there with my orders, and they called a plane back from the tarmac, C-123, dropped the gate, and just that week I had been somewhere in Vietnam in a tent, and there was a sport magazine. Remember the old sport magazine? And the 2 Robinsons were on the cover, Brooks Robinson and Frank Robinson. So when they dropped that gate down, I ran on there and I looked up and saw Brooks Robinson. And then I saw Frank's Robinson. I recognized him. And this was the all-star baseball team going up to Da Nang on a USO flight.
Wow.
And their chaperone was Mel Allen. And I sat across from Joe Torre and Harmon Killebrew. And I remember Joe Torre kind of staring at me like, "Who is this baby-faced kid? We're here fighting this war." And we got in some weather on the way to Da Nang. We're banging up and down in the C-123, and I always was a white-knuckled flyer. You know, so I'm hanging on, and most of the other guys were hanging on. But this is not an exaggeration. One guy standing up with a headset on, telling jokes to the crew. Stan the Man Musial. So if you ever hear the story about Stan is the man, he is. Because he was just as calm as a cucumber. And he was telling jokes, and the guys on the headset with the crew were laughing their tails off. So that was my most famous flight. And one thing about it was, I had my briefcase with my .38 in it. It was an Army issue box. And I didn't know what to do, and the C-130 has a pretty good roar to it, so you couldn't really talk. So I had a month at a glance calendar, you know, on cardboard paper, and I pulled it out and I put a pen with it, and I just motioned it to it, and it went all around the plane. One sheet of paper had 13 All-Stars on it.
You still have that?
It still exists. I sent it home for my nephew's baby book. His name's Clint, too. And maybe 15 years later, we're sitting around at a Thanksgiving Day dinner, you know, and we're talking about this sheet of paper, and I said to my sister, I said, "Where is it?" You know, she says, "Well, it's in Clint's baby book." Well, that night he went home with it, and we don't know. He might have pawned it. He may still have it. But anyway, that was my most famous flight. And there were a couple others. I was telling Donna driving down. I remember one time we were coming out in a Trang, which was pretty safe, but they shot at the tail of the airplane. When we landed at Tonson, you know, out on the tarmac, you could get out and walk around. We went and looked at it, just shot to pieces, the tail of the plane.
Wow.
But that's about as close as I ever came. On all these trips, I would be at some level of airfield, you know, from just the strip iron to paved runway. And I flew caribous, anything that would get me there. But one time I was coming out of somewhere up there, like near the Highlands, and I did see many prisoners of war, all, you know, kneeling in the Vietnamese kneel, about 15 of them all tied together with clothes wire. And that was as close as I got to see actually facing someone I knew was the enemy.
Yeah, interesting.
Where were they at?
You know, I think it was Phu Quoc Plate. What's up near Pleiku that starts with a P? But it was in Tu Corps. It was up in somewhere up there.
Did you deal with the civilians much during your first tour?
The most interesting thing about that is the change I saw in the Field Army Issuing Office. They sent a crew over from the Department of Army to design a bigger facility because we were all just strapped together. And we entertained them for about a week and a half in the BOQ, and they were all GS whatever, 13s, 16s, and they were they had all these books, and they kept asking all these questions and designing this facility. And that was my first real encounter with the Department of Army at the high level.
So these were American civilians?
American, DOA, the Department of Army. And so then I was gone 3 years and went back for my last tour, 1971. And what they had built was, you build it and they'll come. I mean, because I was on Long Bin, I could go look at it because we had moved out there. And it was a large warehouse, completely secure, with 2 levels of fences and concertina wire, and over 100 men assigned to it, you know, with all sorts of security cameras and everything. I didn't get in, but I went all around the exterior of it. And that was what we had mapped out back in '66, you know, which I guess we left behind when we left Vietnam.
Did you deal with the Vietnamese civilians at all?
Yes, we had ARVN counterparts in the Signal Corps. And they would never come into our most secure area, but they would come into the outer lobby. And I think we had some sharing, or we supplied some real fundamental codes to them. And there was a big base right next to Tan Son Nhut out there on the Saigon airport area. And I remember the major, who was our commander, and the other lieutenant, Leonard, and I, we went out there socially a couple of times. And I remember this little short Signal Corps officer in the Army of the Republic of South Vietnam, and his wife and his kids being real proud of this simple one-room home, and the mat, you know, and you sat and had tea, and he could not have been a nicer person. They were wonderful. The ones I knew were wonderful people. And of course, as time goes on, you wonder what happened to them. I'm sure you guys have been through the same experience. You hope that they fared well or got out or something like that. But that was my main encounter with the ARVNs. They had their own supply chain that this guy would have taken care of, so we were just busy taking care of the Americans. Now, I probably ought to deal with some of my second tour, but I came back to the U.S. and had a couple of, my major assignment was with CDEC, Combat Development Command, which was a sub-post of Fort Ord. It was down at a place called Hunter Liggett in Central California, and we used to do experimentations down there, but I wasn't signal specialized. I was just a first lieutenant by then, assigned to help manage the post to the commander who was in Fort Ord.
Now, what type of experimentation?
They would do tanks, arms, all sorts of maneuvers. It was just a huge forested area that they could use for almost anything. That and Fort Irwin, which is the desert area down further south in California, were major maneuver and experimentation places. So I was stationed there, and then I went to Okinawa, where I was in the 1st Signal Brigade. I forget what it was called. The group over there was called, and I got into the adjutant business. They were kind of had enough personnel to where I became assistant adjutant to a large signal group. And what was unique about that was I started as a lay, just college graduate with no legal training, doing legal stuff. You know, just, and the thing I remember the most about Okinawa was there's no rubber stamps in the Army, okay? It's original signature or nothing. Well, my major boss didn't have to do that because he had me, right? So in Okinawa, you were the notary public, you were, the adjutant was everything, and all signatures were original. So I come to work in the morning with a stack of papers like that for the commander. You remember those, right? The orders. And my signature used to be very illegible. You could make out my name, and by the time I left that tour, it was a scratch, just like the doctor on your prescription. But what's interesting about that is when I hit Vietnam, the second tour, this is in 1971, the static nature of the conflict and the drug problem, it becomes so pronounced. I don't even remember a drug problem in '66. But in '71 it was everywhere and it was bad. So we had lots of prosecutions. And the thing that I thought was a little unfair was the guy prosecuting, and by this time I'm in the 1st Signal Brigade, 36th Combat Signal Battalion on Long Bend, but we serviced 3 Corps. We had companies out all over 3 Corps. And the one that was out at Bearcat, we had our biggest drug problem out there with the Thai Division. We had one company of signal guys complementing the Thai Division for communications. And what's funny is the best man at my wedding, who Donna knows very well, is a West Point graduate named Anson Ramsey. He was a commander of that company out at Bearcat, and that's where I had all my problems with the drug and enforcement. So the minute they saw that I had had experience as a legal officer up in Okinawa, man, they put me in this one signal battalion. That's about all I did. I was the adjutant, the S1, but I was heavily involved in the defense. And what they would do is they would put a JAG officer to prosecute the poor guy, and then they'd pick a civilian with very little legal training to defend him. I always thought that was a bit unfair, you know? And I did my best, but most of my guys got convicted. And,
Now, you mentioned that you thought the difference between your first tour, where there was not a drug problem, and the second tour where there was because of the static nature of the war. Can you go into some detail on that?
Well, a couple things had happened. One is it was stand down. Nixon was going through that Vietnamization, and so there were fewer replacements coming through. And in some cases, one person was doing the job that 2 had done. As a, for instance, in that 36th Signal Battalion, just before I left, my old teacher from Fort Monmouth came over, and he was a major. He became battalion commander as a major. And then the XO went home, and he selected me as the XO. I was only XO for, I don't know, 2.5 months, but as a captain, I was executive officer of the Signal Battalion. That was very unusual. We were all 1 grade below. And then there was a rumor, I don't know how true it was, that by then the Viet Cong and the enemy had learned, because we were pulled into, we had pulled into our post or whatever you want to call our enclaves, and they had learned how to sell drugs outside the front gates. And part of the rumor was that they were making the drugs purer and purer heroin. So it was very easy to addict the young soldiers, that were starting with marijuana and experimenting, but they would accidentally get heroin-laced cigarettes or something. And I always said one of the reasons that we brought that thing to a close was we were bringing home so many drug habit young GIs that really not their fault so much as being bored, being in that static location, and the ease of access. So, but like I said, in '66 I don't remember a drug problem. In '71 it was rampant, it really was. But I was in Long Bend and 3 Corps where you would have seen more population, I guess you could say.
Well, now, did you have dealings with the Vietnamese civilians in your second tour too?
I really didn't. We were strictly a combat signal battalion supporting our various, Army divisions. Like I said, the Thai division was one at Bearcat, and I think the Big Red one was another. And we had a lot of microwave shots, and provided the telephones and the radios. And, I have another interesting story that I need to tell you. On my first tour, when I got down to Saigon, replacing that lieutenant, maybe about halfway through that, so it would have been the late summer or fall of 1966, I was signed for these 11 trucks out in some compound in Saigon that had top secret crypto gear in them. So the 24-hour guard and a great responsibility, and it was, we weren't using it because we were attached to MACV and in buildings. So I got this, I heard someone gave me the idea, I think someone had done it, to book them on Army transport and take them back up to Quin Yon and turn them over to the battalion. So I put in all the paperwork, and to my astonishment, it got approved. So the day came, and we went down to Saigon Port, and we oversaw somebody helped us from Transportation Corps. We oversaw the loading up of an LST with it was 9 trucks, but they were like the deuce and a half with that big cab in the back painted green. And we put those trucks on there, and we had to guard them, right, because they were classified. So myself and a Sergeant E6, I've forgotten his name, it might have been Thomas, we were going to ride those things up to Quin Yon. Well, that's halfway up the coast, South Vietnam. So the one thing I remember was the crew was like Philippine or Japanese, not a single one of them spoke English. It was all sign language, going up the coast. But we were guarding it. But they had to make a stop in Cam Ranh Bay to, deliver some cargo or take something on. So we were there overnight. And the mistake I made was I let my Sergeant E8, who had been stationed there earlier in the war, get off the LST to go see his buddies. So the time came to sail north. He was AWOL. So I made the guy wait as long as we could. We had to go. So we started out, and this boat comes roaring out of Cam Ranh Bay, like a speedboat or something, came alongside the LST and had us stop, and it was my sergeant, hung over, jumping on board, avoiding an AWL status, headed to Quin Yon. But that was a funny
Well, talk about that journey. So did you go all the way up?
We went all the way up the coast, but it was pretty uneventful, just because, we could truly control the coast. 6th Fleet, was it? So we had pretty good seas too, and we just had that one night in Cam Ranh Bay and then went into Quin Yon and offloaded the trucks and got that all-important signature of relief. Yeah. And then I flew back, to Saigon. But I had forgotten that story. It was a good one. One thing I remember about Cam Ranh Bay is the Air Force controlled them, and the Navy. And they had wonderful facilities. It was a beautiful port. It was like aqua, green water like you'd find in Destin, Florida. Beautiful, beautiful. And then the best officers club I ever saw in country, right there at Cam Ranh Bay. It was a...
Water ski.
No, I didn't water ski there. Now you're telling stories on me. When I was in Saigon, you can't, they had an R&R spot. I think it was west of the city, but it was on the Saigon River. And we were so young and foolish, we would go out there and take advantage. I think I went out about 3 times, take advantage of the facilities. And you could water ski in the Army, in country. I wasn't going to tell them as part of my war. And the rumor was the other side of the river down a little ways was controlled by the VC. And we're out there, cutting in and out of weights and taking advantage of the, what do they call the R&R division? But anyway, they had some in-country R&R. Of course, the biggest one was in Vung Tau. I never got down there. I just had to fly in the train. But there were in-country R&Rs for the troops, and we all need to be honest about that. Yeah. Oh, and then of course I had a couple R&Rs too.
Now, where did you go on your R&Rs?
My first one, I went to Hong Kong with my buddy Olin. I don't know that I finished that story, did I? Olin was the buddy I made at Fort Gordon that went to Fort Lee with me in supply school, and he had to come over behind me because his wife was having a baby. So I was 20 days ahead of him in country. So by the time he got over, I was established in Saigon, took my Jeep out to Tan Son Nhut and met him at the repo depot and eased his way up to Quin Yon. But he ended up having to do his tour up at the Army base in Quin Yon. And up there, signal, infantry, transportation corps, whatever you were, you took your turns on perimeter patrols. They had the regular patrols of the Army depot around the Quin Yon area. So Olin participated in those. But he talked his way into a job where once a month he would come down and get the pay. The cash to pay. In those days, we all were paid in cash, right? Come down to Saigon, and I'd put him up with my BOQ, and and help relieve his pain. To once a month, my buddy would come down, and he'd always bring a sergeant and get a truck. I mean, there was so much pay, he had to take a truck back out to Tonson Nut to haul the money back to Quinyon. But he was the pay officer for the depot up there. So stop me wherever I was.
No,
You were talking about
going.
R&R.
Keep going.
Oh, I went to Hong Kong with Olin and another guy in the first tour. I think we were very near the end, 10 months into it. And of course, never been to Hong Kong. You know how exciting that city was. And then the second tour, I'd been there, probably I'm not even sure I'd earned it. I'd been there about 5 or 6 months, and I got to go to Sydney, Australia, which was quite an experience. I went with another buddy from my battalion, and we quickly left Sydney and flew up to Surfers Paradise, which everybody knows is the big beach place up near Brisbane. But the Australians served with us in Saigon, and as part of the duty I did at the Field Army Issuing Office on the first tour was I had some interaction with the Australian Signal Corps. They were wonderful guys, and when we would run out of Budweiser and Schlitz, they always had Foster's Lager. Those guys were well equipped. But so anyway, the interesting thing about Surfers Paradise and the second R&R, I always loved Australia so much. I wanted to take my wife Donna back someday, and we had the opportunity about 1989 or 90, and we went back, and we were in between business assignments, so we could stay a while. And I went back on a tour of Sydney and found the same pub I'd been to in 1966 called the Waterloo in the old part of Sydney. And then we went up to Surfers Paradise, and I couldn't recognize the place. I mean, from 1966 to 1989, it's become this international Miami Beach, and we stayed like on the 29th floor of this 40-story building. I mean, and as I recall, the tallest building when I was there in '66 was 3 stories, motel. So I mean, that was quite amazing to have all these contrasts.
Now in Australia, when you went, you were treated pretty well, weren't you?
Oh yeah.
On R&R the first time.
Yeah, Aussies were great. Yeah, they really loved the Americans, and I think they felt more of a role in what was going on in Vietnam because of that treaty we had with them for Southeast Asia, and that's why they sent their troops. I also remember Philippine troops during that first tour being in the signals. They had a contingent of the Philippine Army over there. So we had Thai. I remember delivering codes to the Korean Army. They were up in 2 Corps near Quinyon. You actually go through Quinyon, drive out east, and the Rock Division was out there. And they were no nonsense. I mean, they had an awfully good reputation for fighting the VC and very strict discipline when you went to deliver your codes.
Now after you completed your first tour, did you have in mind making the military a career?
Not really. I was a son of a self-employed insurance broker in downtown San Francisco, and he pretty much corrupted me that was the way you needed to go. But when I met Donna, we gave it some thought because she was a physical therapist in the medical corps and an officer, and by that time I was a captain, and we thought, they said, hey look, we'll station you together. And so we had some opportunity, but we never really seriously considered it. We looked back on it later in life and said, boy, we should have done that.
Now was this between your 2 tours that you all met?
We met my second tour, just as I was getting out of the Army.
Okay.
I came back in December of '71 and was assigned to the Presidio San Francisco by reluctance, OPO. I asked for it and they gave it to me.
What is OPO?
Officers Personnel Office in Washington. And Donna was a physical therapist at Letterman Army Hospital, which was a big facility then, high-rise hospital that's completely torn down now. Because during the last earthquake in San Francisco, it was damaged. So when they changed it from a military post to a national park, they tore that down. And interesting enough, George Lucas has a studio there now, right where Letterman used to be. Lucasfilm, something like that.
What other differences did you see in Vietnam between the first and second tour? You mentioned the the drug problem, did you see any other significant differences either in the attitudes of the soldiers or the
Oh, yeah.
success of the war, or just
Absolutely, night and day.
how about going into some detail on
Well,
that?
as I said, the first tour was early '66, and the majority of the public, and certainly even the draftees, I mean, we were all patriotic, really believed we were gonna win it, and felt a lot of, esprit about what we were doing. And the second tour, I guess it was contributed to the drug problems, but the atmosphere back home was so anti-war. You knew when you went over, you didn't have the support of the majority of the people. And guys were coming home and going into restrooms at San Francisco Airport, changing into civilian clothes so they wouldn't be harassed inside an airport. That was awful. But, over in country, there was more of an attitude in '71 among the troops. They had like chips on their shoulder. I mean, there were exceptions. There were some wonderful, wonderful guys, but there were more of the people that didn't want to be there were complaining. And I think for a drafted Army, we just went on too long. And of course, Nixon did make it a volunteer Army, and I think that's worked out well. And I see like at the VA, I'll see an Afghan and Iraqi veteran, and I make it a point to go up and thank them for their service, because I say, look, I was an obligated volunteer. You're the real thing.
Yeah.
You're a genuine volunteer,
Yeah.
and I really respect them.
There's been a lot written and a lot of stories told about how Vietnam veterans were treated by the American population when they returned. Can you talk about how you were treated after your first tour and how you were treated after your second tour?
Well, I never really suffered or had any bad incidences. It's just that you didn't talk about it the second time. The first time you were real proud about it, and you would talk it up and everybody would want to hear. And you quickly learned when you got back in '71, unless you were on active duty at the Presidio, people didn't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
Or if they did, they weren't going to say, generally they're going to make some criticism, particularly in California.
Yeah.
I mean, they were more anti-war there than other parts of the country, but we all went through it. It's almost like the anti-war movement had way too much press coverage. It got too much attention, and then the people who might have been more objective who watched television got sort of brainwashed. And I think that goes on today with the media. I'm a little prejudiced.
Yeah.
I think some of what the anti-war sentiment in Afghanistan is promoted by the media. Don't you get that sense?
Yeah. Now I'm going back again, but I'm interested in what your first impression of Vietnam was when you first landed, first got there, and particularly your first tour.
Skip, it's funny you said that, because my first impression was when I first landed. We flew all night, and you just certain things stick in your mind. And we were in those short sleeve khaki uniforms. I think it was like Travis to Clark to Tonson. And you land in the middle of the night, and it's cold, and all I remember was they turned the lights out inside the airplane, and they got us to the end of the runway. And you're sitting there not having any idea what to expect. You guys went through this. And I just remember my teeth chattering. I'm going, and they're starting to clack. And just about then, two Jeeps come up alongside. This was like a 707. And both of them got machine guns mounted on the back of them. And all I could think to myself as my teeth clacked was, oh shit, you're really in it now. You are in Vietnam. But one thing led to another, and all you guys are in it together, and you get off and you get over to the repo depot, and there's a certain comfort in having all these other guys in it with you. But I do remember that landing. And I can't even remember the second one.
Yeah.
But I remember the first one.
You had mentioned Max Cleland, and you have a couple of pictures. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, as I said, I sat 9 weeks next to Max at Fort Gordon, Georgia, and went home once or twice with him to Atlanta. And The interesting thing, since he's a public figure now, is he was an only child and he was a great athlete. He was about 6'3", and he was very good at tennis. And I remember going in the family living room out in Lithonia, and they had a whole wall devoted to tennis trophies. He was such a good athlete. And of course, he was a star in those days. He had come down to Fort Gordon after being an intern during the summer on some Senate committee in Washington, and immediately stood out in the class as, you know, high-profile guy. He was always all over the place, you know, real active with his gestures and body. But this is a picture I have of Donna, another classmate, Bill Reber. Max is in the wheelchair at the lower part of the picture, and then I'm on the right. This was about 2 or 3 years ago when they dedicated a room at the Stetson University library to Max's papers and memorabilia, like his awards. He has a Silver Star and various sundry things. He's written 2 or 3 books. So what they did was they took a room at the library and made it the Max Cleland room. And I think he still serves on the board of directors for the university. And when I'm down there in the winter, he'll come down for a board meeting, and we try and get together. And last winter we did. We met with him at a nice hotel around Disney World somewhere. I can't.
Peabody.
The Peabody.
In Orlando.
And he had his gal friend fly in. She used to be on Governor Corazon's staff in New Jersey. That's how they met. Really nice gal. And we had dinner together. And then he was heading over the next day to DeLand, where Stetson is, to go to a board meeting. But of course, Max has kept a really good outward appearance, and I'm hugely in admiration of what he's done with his life, because he's had so much to overcome. Just for the sake of the film, he lost both legs and one arm to a grenade explosion that turned out to be an accident. And for years, he thought it was his grenade, and he was in guilt. And I was actually watching the live broadcast on Larry King one night when he found out it wasn't his grenade. I just happened to be watching. But Larry King interviewed him several times, and one time he was telling Larry how this grenade had come off his pack when he was at a signal site during on-K, because he had to put the top of the hill, and they would hover the aircraft, and he would jump. Well, he jumped, and a couple other people did too, and he thought one of the grenades came off his pack, and he reached for it, and it blew off his hand. That's the arm he doesn't have. And then the damage to his legs was so bad they had to amputate him. But for years and years, he had the guilt of it being his own grenade. Somebody's sitting in suburban Maryland watching Larry King, and he's a Navy corpsman who was there, actually treated Max and the guy behind him. He said, no, it wasn't your grenade. It was the guy behind you's grenade. So he calls in to Larry King. No, wait, he didn't call in that night. The next day, Max is at his office as a U.S. Senator, and this ex-Navy guy calls into Max's switchboard. And the lady says, well, hang on a minute. Transferred him to another guy. Hang on a minute. About the fourth voice is Max Cleland. And they talked for an hour and end up getting together, and then they both went on Larry King on a subsequent program and told the story. But that was some relief to him that, you know, that it wasn't his grenade, because that even made him feel worse. But Max, I don't know if I'm talking out of school or not, but when he lost the election, he was more progressive than the spirit of Georgia, and he lost his seat on the, it was one cycle ago, about 7 years ago. I can't even remember. He defeated Wyche Fowler for his seat, and I think he lost to, it's actually Chambliss. But long story short, he was, I think it's okay to say this, say what happened to him when he lost the election. He had never really suffered post-traumatic stress syndrome. All the tough adjustments he went through at Walter Reed, and having to learn to cook and dress with one arm. I mean, one time he came down to address a Democratic club, although I was not a member, in Sarasota. I met him at the hotel and went to dinner with him, and Donna stayed outside the room. I went and helped him dress. And just dressing is such a time-consuming, energy-draining activity for him. You appreciate what he's been through. But anyway, he kept his spirit up through all that. But when he lost the election, and he had a gal friend that he was engaged to, that they were to be married. And I do not know the circumstances, and to Max's credit, he'll never talk about it, but they broke up. The combination of those two things, he did finally experience post-traumatic stress syndrome and fell back on the VA he ran at one time for help. And of course, they really helped him. And I'd say he's pretty much recovered now.
Good, good.
I haven't seen him this last year, but there's a guy who really gave a lot.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the story of our generation. That you know, he was an ROTC guy at Stetson, and we all went over there with a spirit of you know, serving our country and can do. And the thing, I don't know how you two feel, but the thing kind of wore us down a little bit. You know, I still never regret my service. I mean, I'm very proud of it. It defined my life. I met my wife in the Army, and my best friends. You know, my best man at my wedding lives in Marietta, was the commander of that company out there, Bearcat, a West Point graduate. And Olin out in Texas, I went to see him a couple of years back. Recently went out to Glacier National Park this summer on a vacation, and an old Army buddy who lives in Spokane met me there. So I would say my Army experience was the defining 5 years of my life.
You mentioned that you went back to Australia. Have you ever gone back to Vietnam?
No. I've seriously said I never would do it, but I've thought about it. What happened was Donna has a cousin whose son got married to a Vietnamese gal. And they had the wedding recently out in North Carolina. And there's a group of young Vietnamese, of American youth that are going over there as tourists and meeting Vietnamese. And amazing how free our trade is now. It kind of blows our mind. You know, I do remember one incident along those lines when we took that trip to Australia in '89. You know, when Donna and we took a side trip up to Hong Kong again with the Aussies. Now there's a crazy group of tourists. And they all got back on the plane with 2 bags full of 12 Nikes each. But aside from that, so we took a 1-day trip over to mainland China, which you could do in '89, and it was like a what do you call it, hydrofoil boat. And we landed in the, I don't remember what it's called, Gungshao. It's where the carry-out soldiers are buried, you know, one of the 2 museums. And so we're going to see the carry-out soldiers buried in the ground, the emperor, and the entrance to the museum is guarded by a Chinese soldier with the red star on his hat. And we're talking '89, okay, and I've been out of the Army since '72, and I froze seeing that red star. I mean, it was a surreal experience. I almost didn't go in the museum. Just one of those things, kind of like when you hear a Huey when you're out and they're doing the National Guard, and we got choo, choo, choo. I don't know how I got off on that. Oh, I have thought about going back just in the last couple of years because of meeting this gal's family. She is moving to America, and they're settling in North Carolina. But it was interesting. They had a traditional wedding, and then they took off for a while and came back in Vietnamese traditional dress. You know, the things we were used to seeing them in. And he had on a long silk robe with a little hat on.
But
Got married over there.
based on today's politics, not United States politics, but on today's politics with Vietnamization of Vietnam, what's your feelings on the Vietnam War now?
Well, that's a tough question.
I know it is, and I wrestle with it every day.
You know, it changes. I think the people at the time did the best they could do. I remember going out to the Carter Center when McNamara was releasing his book. A whole bunch of us were there. And in his book, he kind of did a mea culpa and said I was wrong. And we should have all accepted that. But we were catcalling him that night because we felt like McNamara was Curtis LeMay's statistical man in World War II. He was in the Army Air Force, and Curtis LeMay was his boss. And McNamara's whole job was to keep count of the bombings over in Japan. And he was brilliant at it. And he was good with the Ford Motor Company, keeping track of the cars coming off the assembly line. But as far as making policy about Vietnam, I think he was the wrong man. And of course, Johnson, this is just my theory, because I read history, he just inherited McNamara and Rusk from John Kennedy. I have a feeling he might have had more practical guys in there. but he worshipped him. I think he put too much weight on what Rusk and McNamara told him, which in my opinion was terrible stuff. You know, I mean, and Johnson was the kind of guy that would not give up. I mean, you know, the first thing Clark Clifford did when he came in there as Secretary of Defense, when they eased McNamara out after he said he made a mistake and Johnson didn't like him saying that, was Clark Clifford was this real established lawyer in Washington who had everybody's respect, including Lyndon Johnson. And he made a couple of trips and talked to a bunch of people and got an appointment at the White House and went in to see Lyndon Johnson. He said, "We got to get out of there." And Johnson was really mad at the guy. This is all in the history book. But, you know, that's when Lyndon Johnson decided he wasn't running again, and he, you know, but Clark Clifford made him see the light. But I mean, this is 1968. And you think of how many people were accidentally died or lost their lives in Vietnam from 68 until 75 when Ford finally pulled the plug. It's really, that part of it's a tragedy, hanging on so long.
Tell us a little bit about your life after the military.
Well, I pursued the calling of my dad, and he used to tell me as a kid that you were a complete failure if you weren't self-employed. So I didn't want to be a complete failure. So I went into the insurance business on my own, and I had 3 separate agencies where I was a small agent, and Donna actually was my partner in 2 of them, only 3 of them. And because I couldn't work for my father, because then I wouldn't have been self-employed, we gravitated to the Southeast and really spent our adulthood here in either Jacksonville or Atlanta. And I sold my last agency in 2000. And now I started teaching risk management part-time for continuing ed, and now I try and teach business part-time. I mean,
Yeah.
but I think some of the things I learned in the Army as far as time organization, I never wore a watch till I was in the Army when I had to. I never drank coffee till I was in the Army and had to. Some of those things held me in good stead, you know, as self-employed. I don't know how many of them.
Yeah. Don, I want to give you a chance to either add anything or remind Clint of anything you want to remind him of, or just say anything you'd like to say.
Well, thank you. Well, I guess because I'm his biggest fan, he really, you know, he really excelled.
I'm going to move the camera over. Sure.
You want
We want
to
to
switch
get,
places?
that might be the easiest thing.
Yeah.
Why don't you go sit there for a
Oh,
second? We'll
That way it'll be focused.
just,
Okay. Well, just to add a few things to all that Clint has told you, he really excelled. He wouldn't want to tell you these things because he'd be too modest, but I remember when I met him, he had gotten you know, hundreds on all of his officer evaluations when he was in Vietnam and when he had helped with the legal proceedings and all that. So I thought, wow, this guy's really special. He was really very successful in all that he did, you know, as an officer in the Army. Even though he went to Berkeley, it panned out well in the end. And then he did, of course, follow in his dad's footsteps in the insurance business and excelled in that tremendously. He started, you know, his own agency, and you know, the companies he represented, he was always the top salesperson, and I think his natural skills and things he did learn, as he said, in the Army, really helped him in relating to people and time organization.
What about your experience with the Vietnam vets at Letterman?
Oh, okay. Well, he doesn't want me to talk about that too much, I don't think, but I just wanted to add that he was, you know, really successful in his military career and as an insurance agent and insurance owner. And, you know, for myself, I'm from South Carolina and graduated from the University of Georgia, came over, yeah, go Dogs. And
This sucks, you're not.
and I was in pre-med at Georgia, interested in the medical field, and I was sort of looking at that and thinking about it, and a recruiter came around to the university from the Army Medical Specialist Corps. That's a little different from the Army Nurse Corps. It is the corps for the physical therapist and the dietitians and the occupational therapists. And so she was telling about this postgraduate program that they offered to train graduates that had the courses, the science courses, to become physical therapists. Of course, they needed physical therapists, occupational therapists, and were really starting to need them with all the activity from Vietnam. So I remembered that, and I had moved to Atlanta after graduating from Georgia, and I called over to Fort McPherson and got connected with the recruiter there, and she met me, and we hit it off. I had good grades in pre-med, so that helped, and she got me into the program, and I went to Brooke Medical in San Antonio, and I was trained there. I got my postgraduate degree as a physical therapist, and it was just a great, wonderful opportunity. Like Clint said, I met people from all over the country. I'd lived in the South all my life, and got top-notch training because physical therapy had actually started in the Army during, I think it was World War I. Sister Kenny, just in rehabbing the soldiers that were injured, actually started the profession of physical therapy. So anyway, after I had finished my training in San Antonio, I got a choice of Walter Reed, to go to Walter Reed Hospital in the Washington area, Fitzsimmons in Denver, Madigan, I believe, in Seattle, and then Letterman in San Francisco. And I said, San Francisco? I thought, what a great place to be. And so I applied for that and fortunately got it. And so I was stationed there, and we treated, the guys. Of course, I had treated the guys coming out of Vietnam at Brooke, and it was really sobering.
What about the burn clinic?
Seeing, the terrible injuries, that came out of, the landmine injuries, the plane crashes, and some of the burn patients were really particularly traumatic. So, that was challenging, should I say?
Thank you for your service too.
Oh, well, thank you. But I never did go to Vietnam.
That's okay. You played a big part in helping those who did.
Well, thank you. And so, anyway. And then, just to finish up really quickly, when I was stationed at Letterman Hospital, I was dating one of Clint's friends, and we went to a party of a mutual friend, and we met, and the rest is history.
Good. Well, Clint, why don't you go back? I want to give you one more chance, and I really appreciate you sharing those experiences. That added a lot to this. Before we finish, I just want to give you a chance to say anything you want to say to people who will be watching this in the near future or down the road, or anything that you didn't talk about that you want to talk about now, just anything you want to say.
Well, as I said earlier, before we were on the camera, I had this thing on my desktop computer, 50 pictures of the Vietnam War, and I just kept it there to look at from time to time. So this weekend I sent it out to like 40 recipients, mostly Army buddies, and I said, hey, I'm going to be interviewed for this legacy project on Monday, and I'm just reflecting back, and I went over a couple of the experiences I've described here, but at the end I said, we all should hold our heads high that served in Vietnam, because we answered our country's call. I mean, the country made the decision that this was an important stand, kind of like Korea, with the North Vietnam and the South Vietnam. And we all went willingly and served proudly, and then, to some extent, and history books will debate this for years, we helped end the Cold War. Because the Cold War did end, at the end of Ronald Reagan's term in the early 90s, and that was a big threat to world peace, and really affecting the growth of all of the world, because there were these two superpowers lining up all these third world nations to compete. And then finally, warfare has developed since Vietnam, and we were the first major conflict that employed counterinsurgency. And now you look at what's going on in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the future is with the special forces and counterinsurgency. And General Petraeus wrote this textbook manual on counterinsurgency, and then that's the future. And I think a lot of the lessons that we learned in Vietnam went into helping to preserve our freedom and this new specialty of warfare. So I think we all served our purpose. It's just funny how history plays out, you know, that it went on so long and disrupted so many lives. I mean, when you look at the quantity of names on the wall, you're just, as you guys are, just blown away with the number of poor guys that, and I have been up there. I mean, I went up to the wall with Donna's parents on one trip, and the funny thing was I was looking up someone that I had lost in one of my units, and Donna and her mother found 2 of her high school classmates from Greer, South Carolina, before I could find a soldier.
Gosh.
I mean, that's how much it affected everyone in America.
Yeah.
So I just want all Vietnam veterans to be proud. You know, we were just as important as some of those World War II vets that actually did save the world over there on Point de Hoc.
Yeah. Well, you've just imparted a lot of wisdom. Appreciate you making those comments for the story, and so they'll be recorded from time immemorial. And I really want to thank you for coming down here, you and Donna.
It's our pleasure.
I mean, you not only served one tour, you served 2 tours, and you didn't have to serve that second tour. I'm sure you could have left the Army after that first tour, and you played a big part in what went on over there, and you were active, and you had a great attitude, and I'm sure you were a heck of a leader while you were there. So we really appreciate what you did.
I was very fortunate. I mean, I didn't come home, you know, psychologically impacted. I came home a stronger person. I mean, it really developed me.
Okay. Well, thank you for your service, and thank you for coming here today. It's been an honor to hear your story.
Well, thank you skipping in. I told you I